Hello, I'm Jay Hirsch, Director of Administration of Columbia's ERM program. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, CRO Spotlight Series, featuring Holly Kulka of S&P Global Ratings. I'd like to tell you about some exciting upcoming events we have planned. On Thursdays, we have our mindfulness seminars. On Fridays, we have our coding seminars. And weekly on Saturdays, we have our IQRM seminars. On March 16th, our next panel is on credit risk, pandemic, and recovery. On March 17th is the next of our coffee and conversation networking events. On March 18th, we have a panel planned on the future of compliance and risk management in banking. On March 22 is our next CRO Spotlight Series. And on April 1st is our first Alumni Series panel. And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Sim Segal, founder and director of the ERM program at Columbia University and president of Symergy, an ERM consulting firm. Sim?
Thank you, Jay, and a welcome to everyone joining us today. We're proud to bring you today's event, CRO Spotlight Series, featuring one-on-one interviews with leading chief risk officers. Our featured CRO today is Holly Kulka. Holly Kulka is Executive Managing Director and Global Chief Risk and Compliance Officer, S&P Global Ratings. She leads globally integrated risk and compliance teams, including the criteria and model validation groups. And Holly ensures compliance with all relevant laws and regulations, as well as internal policies and industry best practices. Holly previously served as Executive Vice President, Deputy General Counsel for Intercontinental Exchange, where she was responsible for regulatory strategy, litigation, investigations, antitrust, insurance, privacy, and human resource legal matters. Before that, she was a partner at the law firm of Heller Ehrman, representing and advising companies and individuals in state and federal commercial and regulatory investigations, corporate governance questions, and litigations through trial. Holly holds a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. Holly, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
Pleasure to have you. So before we really get into it, can you just start out by giving us a brief overview of your career path?
So as you heard, I've been around a little bit. I think what's relevant to this group is that I didn't go right out of college or university to get my JD, that I actually first went into investment banking of all things. And I worked on some of the early versions of collateralized securities, so the CMOs and things like that, very early on. Looked a lot different than now. Then I went to law school. Then I came out and did a bunch of things, including I was a federal prosecutor. So I had a big piece of my time in government. I was also in a political area at Department of Treasury. And then, as you said, I had this a bunch of work in the private industry. And most recently, I came to S&P Ratings. I came first as head of compliance, and then I took over risk over about 3 years ago. So I've been there 5 years. And so I run what we call the entire second line of defense, which I'm sure is something that gets discussed a bit, which is pretty typical for organizations that have a lot of regulatory oversight, which we do. So, and I work for S&P Ratings, which was one of the largest credit rating agencies in the world. We are highly regulated, highly reported upon by news agencies, academics, investors, et cetera. So we are in the spotlight. So reputation is, I always say is that our reputation and our importance to the capital markets exceeds our market cap, because we are not as big as a bank or some of these other very large financial institutions, but we are really important to the capital markets.
Thank you for sharing your career path and a little bit about S&P. Can you now, in terms of your enterprise risk management program, can you start to describe how you do your qualitative risk assessments to identify potential key risks at S&P? Right.
So, it's an interesting question, because it really depends for us how we do it. We've actually only been doing it seriously for 5 years, right? We were regulated, but not highly regulated. We had big slip and fall. Some of you may know there was a lot of litigation involving my company, both from regulators and private parties. So, and there was a big change in the regulatory environment, and we had a new set of rules. So about 5 years ago, we started to get our act together, and it's a lot. You can't, it's not an overnight. It's not a, 180 type of thing. You can't do it. So for the last 5 years, we've worked on our program, and now our program is quite pervasive. So when we go about looking at our key risks, now, first of all, they don't change a lot quarter to quarter, right? They do change the increment, but what we do is we start from the baseline, which took us, 5 years to get to. That's not an easy thing. And then we look at everything, right? We look at every, we're good at centralizing information. So we look at any type of thing that's happened. Is there an audit report and an audit finding? Is there a compliance report, a compliance finding? Are there the various metrics? There's various monitoring we do in the first line and second line. We look at all those metrics. We have KRIs, key risk indicators. I don't put too much emphasis on them, but they help to figure out when you need to look a little more closely. We do interviews of all the stakeholders, including ourselves. And we also look at every type of event that's happened. We call them IEMs. Anytime we have an outage, technical outage, or some other thing that might have happened, it could be a weather event, things like that. And we put that all together in the big cauldron, and we look for things that are different from the past, right? Because as I said, the big risks are stable, and we look for things that are different from the past, and then we try to identify what's new.
So let me just go back a little bit with, I'm just taking notes on some of what you said. In terms of the interview stakeholders, so if you could walk us back, it's a good point you're making in terms of there's a formal performance of interviews with a wider group, and then there's maintenance of it in between reperformance formally. And for different sectors, yours is, you said, it's more stable in terms of your key risks. You can go longer. For Silicon Valley, it maybe is every year or more. Some companies 1 or 2 years, maybe on the average, maybe 2-3 years formal reperformance. Can you walk us back to when you initially formally performed it? How many stakeholders were involved? How did you conduct those interviews? How did you arrive at the final list and get a consensus on it? And also then, how do you maintain it? Like, how do you actually reach out with those interviews?
Right. So you're asking back in the initial, when we started this process X years ago. So I would say I can't even look at it that way because it's complicated and it's evolving. So when we started, what we would have called a risk 5 years ago would be very different than what we call a risk now, right? Back then we might have said technology. What does that mean, right? Now we might say, app delivery or something, or outage time. Like, we've gotten much more sophisticated. We've gotten down to the levels of the risk. So when you begin, that's right, we have a problem. Our technology doesn't work. Okay, that is a risk, but it doesn't really help you solve the problem. It's too big in this day and age where technology is pervasive. You need to kind of get down, but it takes time. So in the beginning, it was much more qualitative like that, although I would say it's still pretty qualitative, but now it's much more refined. We are looking at those. So if someone says, I have a problem, we're like, okay, prove it, right? To some extent. And we don't actually, it's not 100%, but in the beginning too, people were raising their hands and it was a mess, right? We would have one, single person whose laptop didn't start one day said, oh my God, we can't access the networks, right? That's not necessarily good information, right? It's not, it's not good that person couldn't get on, but it doesn't mean we have a pervasive problem. So we've gotten much more sophisticated in the process. But in the beginning, I think the other key thing here is you have to know your business, right? And so some of the risks are pretty obvious, right? For us, all the regulation is around conflicts of interest. So we know that that's a potential key risk. Now we think that's mitigated down. So it's inherent, but not necessarily residual. But some of the risks, I would say at least 75% of the risks are pretty obvious.
So you mentioned, and it's true, all organizations where you start more formal, excuse me, ERM programs, there's a learning curve. It's not minutia. It's not what happened just in the past. It's not this vague general threat. You need to have focus, prioritization, reasonable level of granularity, and of course analyzing risk by source and really thinking them through and then scoring them, sorting them out. What's your process now to have the discussions? Is it just continual? Is it continual feed into you from various areas, or do you reach out? How many people roughly are involved when you reach out?
So I would say it's continual, but we also have, point in time. So and we have certain external events that help us organize that. For example, we have board meetings and regulator meetings. So for example, next week we have a board meeting and we will be presenting our top risks there and getting their input on those top risks. So we that's easy, right? We got to do that around this time of year. We got to lead up. We know we have to back into the March board meeting to get that information together. So we do that annually, a more formal process of reevaluating. But it's and then in the middle of the year we'll look at it a little less formally. But the real bottom line is that it's continuous because we're monitoring these metrics all the time. So we have these KRIs, we have a lot of activity monthly that looks and puts together all of our these things that I was mentioning. We have reports on all of these findings and issues and IEMs and things. And so we easily could change, during the year. I don't know whether we'd actually change the heat map, but we know to shift our resources to fix issues if there's something that comes up more continually.
When you get this feedback, do you mostly analyze reports, or do you do personal live interviews? Do you conduct interviews, or you do both?
So it's mostly the reports, but we know everyone, every issue. I mean, the reports actually in a good unified program like we have, and then we have a bit of a luxury that maybe some of the banks don't have because we're smaller, right? We aren't as big as a bank. We don't have 100,000 people. We don't have 3,000 to 5,000 people in our compliance risk programs, right? That makes it harder to organize. But my view, and I say this all the time to the person who works for me who's head of risk, who presents to the boards, I don't want to be in a position when you're presenting to the compliance committee or the board where everything hasn't been talked about before. You're just collating that information, right? That's not the first time people should be hearing about something that's happened. So by the time it gets into the reports, even every month, each individual item has pretty much we've known about, right? What we're looking at then is, did we miss a trend, right? So we see monthly. Now when you see the metrics, the value is, oh, I didn't realize we had that X times, right? Or, oh, that's interesting. Maybe we need to break out that risk into a second or third level risk because now we're seeing, a bunch of those things and what really is the issue, right? So the correlation allows us to understand it better, but we've already known about it. And then maybe we'll go back, but presumably and speak to people and try to get, better view of it. Maybe we need to have better metrics or something.
Okay. No, that gives a good description. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the scope? Because enterprise risk management should address all sources of risk. And as you know, some organizations are more focused on certain types of risk. In terms of strategic, operational, financial insurance, do you look at the full scope?
We do. We do look at the full scope. Now, this is a typical problem where you can quantify some things and you can't quantify others, and you got to make sure that you balance that. And that is a struggle, right? If you can't quantify it, it's not 0. If you can't quantify it, it's not 100, right? So you need to figure out a way. And we don't try to quantify things that are non-quantifiable. We do not do that. That gives you false precision. But you still have to figure out, how do you mitigate the risk? How do you, expose the risk?
So you mentioned a couple of things about assessment. Let me move on to ask you another question I want to ask you, which is how do you approach the assessment or quantification? I mean, you talked about your qualitative part of your QRA, but how do you go further?
It depends. We don't try to equate. We don't come up with some kind of metric that we then apply an algorithm and it works across all risks. So we don't do that. I know some companies do. We don't do that. But we have the KRIs, and we have, for every different thing we're looking at, there's something that's happening behind the scene, the monitoring. And so we know what the monitoring is that produces results, which, are able to turn into metrics, right? So we'll pick some number that makes sense, and there's a challenge to the number where there's a KRI, key risk indicator, and that's really what we use. But it's different. We have some things that are measured on a 12-month rolling basis, some things that are measured on a monthly basis. It really depends on the thing, and we spend a fair amount of time deciding what makes the most sense for those KRIs, and they change all the time. We'll say, wait a second, we're not rigid about it. That doesn't make any sense anymore. It's not helpful information. We never breach that. So either we should not really follow it as closely, or maybe we picked a number that is too high.
So you're mostly using Curate, and this is more on the downside exposure. Do you have anything that allows you to look at upside volatility so you're able to feed in the risk reward profile into decisions?
We do. That's a really good question. It's a little more qualitative than that, but yeah, if we never breach a metric, the question is, are we looking in the wrong place, or is our metric wrong, right? So are we wasting our time looking at something where there's no problem? So we look at it that way, but we don't have, besides that, we don't have, an upside type of program. But we do, the problem also is that there's always new things happening. I said it's stable, but it's not, it's stable in that we're always trying to solve similar problems. Like the cyber problem is very expensive and big, and it's not going away. It's stable, but we have to keeping up with the bad guys there. So, or the mistakes. So as we put resources there, we need to take resources away. It's a very bad, policy to just keep adding and never subtract. So it's almost a definitional thing, right? We need to be looking at low value work, low value monitoring, because even if the monitoring is in the background and you've got it, robotics against it or something like that, you still have to monitor the outcome. So it's not a zero amount of work to monitor, even if you have computers helping you.
I don't know if you can share this, but I was hoping maybe you could tell us one story of an event simulation exercise that your company went through. Can you share anything like that?
So that's really interesting. So we do simulations. Sometimes we do simulations which are just dollar driven. So we're told to stress to a certain dollar amount. Now, I don't frankly understand that much. I mean, I'm happy to do that for the finance department, and we do it. But if you have a stress amount, just tell me what the stress amount is, right? And just put the number in your algorithm. And I don't want to put too much work behind it, because you know the outcome. The outcome is you want to stress whatever your company's balance sheet is to X dollars, and that's fine. And you should do that, obviously, to figure out what you can handle. But what I like to do is something very realistic. And so we really lucked out. So in the end of 2019, so we are a credit rating agency. We have, dozens and dozens of very, very high profile economists who work in my company who make predictions that we then use as baseline information. It's out there in the market, investors love it, all that, but we also then turn around and use it. The analysts use it as part of their baseline calculations and application when they come up with the credit scores for various entities. So we were predicting quite publicly an economic downturn globally, and obviously different by country. That was very public. We were predicting it. There was a time frame questions, severity questions. So we said, okay, let's take our own prediction to the end of 2000. This was actually, it ended in 2019, but so it's a few months before that. So mid 2019. Let's take our prediction and use it and see what happens to our company in an economic downturn. And it's not like a regular company, right? When an economic downturn happens, that's our job. Our job is to watch credits through different economic scenarios, specific scenarios to the company, but more broad scenarios. So what happens if all of our companies are stressed at the same time? What happens to them and to us? Do we have the ability to keep up with that type of data coming in? We have an obligation. Once we rate something, we have an obligation to continue to keep that information up to date. So we went through this stress process, which was pretty big deal, right? Do we have enough people? Do we have if we're going to do bulk ratings, right? If we have to take down a whole industry or a whole country or something, can we do that? So we stressed all of our systems. We found some issues. We fixed those issues, right? We were well aware of what were going to be our resource issues, all that. And then guess what happens in 2020? We have a very severe economic downturn, far more severe than anyone predicted. We certainly did not predict a health event on top of the economic downturn and people working from home. But because of all the work we've done over the last 5 years about resiliency, identifying our risks, dealing with BCP, business continuity, as well as, making sure our people understood our policies and procedures for material non-public information, we were able to move very quickly into this new world where we were stressed, where our people had a lot more work to do, where our systems were stressed, both because there was more work coming out, but also because it was distributed network, right, that no one had expected in the world, that everyone was going to work from home and not the office. So it was a really great success story, and we're very proud of the fact that we did that, and the business took it seriously. This wasn't just the second line running around. This was the first line being involved, spending their time, very senior people thinking this through, and from a technology side, from an analytical side. So it works. If you pick a risk scenario that is something that is very realistic to your business.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it shows the power of enterprise risk management. Of course, there's varying levels of what you can do this for. You can't do this for all the different key risks and scenarios you have. But you're reminding me of a panel discussion we had with myself and one of our other ERM leaders, Basil Rabinowitz, and he was the chief risk officer function at Assurant and thinking through the pandemic. So prospectively thinking about pandemic scenarios, a lot of companies have thought about that before this came about in enterprise risk management, particularly insurance companies that have claims through that and have different impacts on their products, not just the balance sheet. And of course, as part of the work that I do, and he was my client in the past. And so I shared stories about my clients and how they projected it and sort of did a blend on it, on the assumptions used. And most people, of course, believe that in a credible worst case pandemic, you would have a severe economic downturn, a turn on a par that we had. In fact, one of my former clients called me up after the pandemic hit, and he goes, "Oh, yeah, well, of course, bad news." He goes, "But the work that we did to think it through, not in terms of event simulation, but the failure modes and effects analysis, to think of by source, thinking through what would happen step by step, how would the environment react, how would you react, which products would be affected." He said, pretty much we were pretty accurate. And so, of course, then we're prepared to be able to deal with other things and not be surprised at which products be affected maybe. I remember I had another client said that they realized there would be an opportunity to help people in a pandemic in terms of having a product ready to go and to release it at that time, because it could be a good opportunity, but also good for the market. Anyway, so there's a lot that can be done in enterprise risk management, thinking things through, and a lot of people haven't gone through those exercises, so they were at a disadvantage. So.
Yeah, and we were also lucky because, of course, we weren't thinking pandemic, so I can't say we
right. You were just focusing on the
and we weren't
part.
stressing to severe economic. We were stressing to because the predictions we had were that it was likely there'd be at least a mild, right? So very, very likely it was more than 50%. So all right, so we were actually stressing to something realistic. Then of course it was more than that, but because it was kind of a likely scenario, it worked out really well for us. And then that allowed also the business to be more interested in working on it because it was their prediction and it was likely. It wasn't a pandemic, which is, these black swan events that, people are like, well, I don't want to waste my time on.
Yeah, it is more engaging. Of course, there's credibility to establish after you go through something like that. People have seen retrospectively the value, and then you get more engagement as well. So that's all good there from that aspect. Can you talk about, at least in a general way, what types of decisions are informed by the ARM program?
So I would like to say, and I think it's right, pretty much everything. Now that is maybe a bit unique for a credit rating agency because we are really highly regulated. We have a lot of, specialized boards that are required pursuant to regulation. But all of our, and also we have a great president who takes the stuff very seriously. But we do everything based on some form of risk analysis. So whether it's a new product, when we're trying to understand, all the different risks, and we have no choice but to look at regulatory risk because we can't just launch any old product we want. We have regulatory requirements around whether we can do a product, how the product, all those things. But also then what we try to do is layer in a strategic area and operational type of risk. Like, is this workable? How will this work? Because for us, any of the failures in that area might impact our from a regulatory perspective, from a compliance perspective. So for us, operational risk events, realized operational risk events, quite often turn into compliance events because of the regulation we have.
Can you share, other than what you just shared, some of the successes of the ERM program? What benefits have been gained as a result of ERM that you can tangibly point to?
It took a long time to get here, but I would say that we are really embedded in the business. The mentality is embedded. We are appreciated and we're credible. Like we try not to be overly intrusive, or if we are or have to be very clear as to why we're doing something. And regulators, and a lot of our business people are in front of regulators all the time, so they got religion when that started to happen with the regulators. But I think the success is that as a result of some of the way we apply risk to everything we do, we have seen, we can actually show before and after examples of things that have gotten dealt with earlier in the process, right? If you end up with something later on, and then suddenly you realize you don't have the resources. That's a good risk, right? Are we capable of doing the thing we want to do? You realize way down the line, you have all the lawyers are fine with it, compliance is fine with it, but you haven't figured out whether you produce the product. That's pretty late. So when you deal with that risk earlier on, then you don't waste senior resources down the line. And you don't, it's frustrating to have that. So I would say that there are a lot of benefits like that, as long as you do it right. I mean, identifying risk doesn't mean you can't take risk, right? So you have to make sure that people understand it and are putting the decision in the right place, the people who are going to be living with that risk. So for example, a resource issue, right? You got to make sure that the business is the one that owns that and makes decisions on what they're going to do about it.
So it sounds like it's embedded in the planning. When you're planning, and so you can execute, you have a better chance of executing on it.
Right.
So it's interesting because it reminds me of a client example where it was embedded in the strategic planning process. That's the first step in a value-based enterprise risk management approach, which is what I use. And they started realizing and going through the risk scenarios that a lot of the executives were not on the same page in terms of what they even believed they were committing to in some key details of the strategic plan, and how they were going to, and whether they could accomplish it in terms of the likelihoods of the different scenarios and of the baseline. And it caused them to stop and discuss it with the CEO. And he said, "No, good." He goes, "I knew we had disconnects. I didn't know, exactly where. Now we can discuss it and get it back on track." So that kind of proactive thinking, so you don't get into trouble and get surprised down the line. And that's really the value of a chief risk officer. Yeah.
You're completely right. And also the way that, the risk people think about things is very focused, and that can be sometimes you can have some issues, but it can be very, very good because this kind of sometimes the qualitative nature, people know there's something out there, they can't pinpoint it, but the risk officer is like forcing you in a particular way to think about it, right? So you can at least identify it. Not that you're going to stop something, but you can say, okay, again, with the technology risk, what is the problem? What's the problem with your technology? Like, let's figure out what is the thing. And then once you're there, you can identify, you can resource it, you can quantify it, all those things. But it's a way of thinking that might be different from like a salesperson that forces them to kind of get to the end quicker.
I like that you said that, because it's true. When you sit in your seat, or the work that I do working with chief risk officers, you see from a consistent basis, you're comparing everybody's thoughts, and you're able to organize with some rigor and discipline and discern, all right, these are minor. Of course, you want to do it Socratically and gently. You want to let people come to their own conclusion, but you can see it coming. And it also helps people realize, oh, okay, I've been worried about this. I should be worried about that instead. And that's not where I want to put my time, attention, and resources. And that's really valuable. So having some kind of a disciplined process, that's part of what we're talking about.
And also neutral, right? I mean, in theory, if you do it right and you aren't overly focused, like sometimes, CROs get themselves in trouble because it's a big no, right? It's always a no, because a risk is a no, but of course the risk isn't a no, risk is just one of the many inputs, but you're really neutral. Like whether you do the new product or not, it's not really relevant to you. It's not has nothing to do with your compensation, but you can sit there versus you might have, competing factions on the business side, and you're just kind of calling strikes and balls.
What would you say, you shared some of the successes, what would you say some of the remaining challenges ahead? What are your priorities for advancing your program in, say, the next year or two?
Well, there's always things to be done, right? So I think a big area emerging is for everybody in this space and highly regulated is affiliate dependencies. So, there's the way companies are organized now, different parts of the company provide different services. It could be just finance, right? Or HR, but it could be a data subsidiary. And so how do you make sure that is working like a vendor? So for us, we're really required to treat and it's not bad practice to treat all of our affiliates as vendors, right? So, but that's not that easy from a political standpoint, but it's also not how you're set up in a company. But and that's not a financial thing, that's really a quality thing, right? How do you make sure that what you're getting from them meets the standards that you would impose on a third party? Because the regulators expect you to own your own destiny. It doesn't matter if you say, daddy made me do it. That's irrelevant, right? You have to make sure that the standard. So that's hard. That's very hard to do from many perspectives. And then by the same token, vendors, there's been a lot more focus on vendors because you just don't own the vendors. You don't have, knowledge of what they're doing, what they're outsourcing, what their work from home protocol is, when you're dealing with sensitive data. So that is, I think, a big focus. And another one for us, maybe more so than other companies, but maybe not, is, how do you bring together the global framework, right? We've been doing that a lot. We're very proud of it, but it constantly stretches out because every regulator is a sovereign. And we're trying to get them kind of all organized centrally so that we can meet some kind of standard that is not inconsistent globally. But it's a constant battle because every regulator has a particular thing they're interested in at a particular moment, and you need to kind of make that work within the big ecosystem of a company like ours, which has a global product.
Of course, you mentioned vendor risk management, and that's gotten a lot more focus lately. And of course, it's more difficult because to know exactly what's going on, it's challenging. That's what ERM is, to really figure out internally and get people to be consistent and unbiased and provide information and sort it out for better risk-reward decision making. When you're one arm's length removed with a vendor, and then of course they're using vendors, and the information you have on that, it reminds me many years ago. The first half of my career, I worked at MetLife. So one of the last projects I did there was to rewrite the reinsurance practice standard for the company. And, I was just learning at the time about reinsurance, and it was so complicated because you can't know. So you put it out there. We had a huge amount. We had, at that time, this is 1998.
With 19 in front of your.
Yeah, I know. Even saying 19 sounds ridiculous to many of our viewers. But we had $1 trillion of in-force net, but we had a half a trillion inward and then a half a trillion outward. So, and the outward, looking at it, you can't tell. These things are mixed in pools that we may even be participating back in. You can't track it. There wasn't an ability, you don't have that ability. So it's similar in vendors. Like, you really don't know. There's no way to know all of it, but it's very, very challenging. But of course, more focus can be.
Yeah, that issue is repeating in all different ways, and a lot of it has become political, I woare now, given what's going on in the world, where are you allowed to do things cross-border, and do countries, are you allowed to have your data moved across border? Again, this goes to some extent to affiliates, right? Because every company has to have a different corporate structure in every country they're in. So these are evolving issues as we deal with politics on top of real life risk issues on top of regulatory issues.
Let me switch gears a little bit and just ask you about communication. So what's your approach to ERM communications with external or key external stakeholders, I would say, like SEC's Office of Credit Ratings and others? Right.
So as I said, we're highly regulated. I think people would be surprised to hear how often we are talking to our regulators. It's definitely around the world. We track it. It's constant. And so there's two types of communications with them. There's push and pull. Right. So they pull a lot, depending on the regulator. For example, the SEC by statute is required to come into every single CRA, large or small, risky, non-risky, every year and examine at least 8 topics. So it's very statutorily driven. And that's a year-long process. So they're basically with us for most of the year as they gather the data, do the interviews, come up with preliminary findings, final findings, all of that. So we live with them. So that's the pull. And then there's the push, where something comes up, whether it's a change of a key employee personnel. There's no legal requirement to let them know, but we will to risk events or realized risk events, things that happen. So it's a bit of a dance. You have to have high EQ to figure out when to tell them. Like, they're going to get it in their pulls. Right. So we make sure, in fact, one of my key questions I ask if something's happened is that on an IEM log somewhere? Because the key for me is I don't want anything hidden from the regulators. I want them to either get it from pulling or us to push it. Right. And anything we push should also be identified elsewhere, so they'll get it from a pull. So the transparency is, when do we reach out and call them? And we can't call them every time. They don't want to hear it. It's not their problem. They don't want us to just dump our problems in our laps. But there's certain things that we have to figure out, what we should let them know in advance. They don't want to read about it in the paper. They don't want to read about it when they pull, a log from us. So we spend a lot of time thinking about, what to tell the regulators. And because we're globally regulated and because our regulators talk to each other, that kicks off a chain. If we're going to tell the SEC, are we telling other regulators around the world? And we're very coordinated about that, if something's happening, outage, or you name it, something that, or some major event in the market that isn't even a risk event for us, but it's going to be interesting for them, and most likely they're going to second guess us about. So, for example, a big credit event. So there's that piece. That's very, very transparent and very proactive. But the boards we meet quarterly, but we have sometimes interim communications similar if there are big events. But during the meetings with them, we're pushing them all of our information. We want to be transparent, and we want to give them the information that they can make evaluations from. Now, we can't give them everything again, so we have to make judgment calls. But we make sure that the back of our packets, the appendix, has information. So often they're never fulfilled, right? Boards are never fulfilled. They always want more and more and more. So what you want is have them ask a question and say, "That's a very good question on page 23 of your appendix." Boom, and then they don't ask any more questions, right? So they don't want you to kind of spoon feed every single thing to them, but they want to know that you're on top of it, and they want to know that if they want to look for it, it's there. So it's a big transparency thing, and it gives you credibility so that when you have a problem, which of course you do, they know you're going to fix it, right? And almost all of our problems are self-identified, which is a major benefit as well for credibility.
Yeah, boards definitely, that's their major job, right? They have a real hunger. And I find when boards look at risk information packets, they all will, dive into different aspects of sort of the ones they focus on more and ask good questions on. I just want to be mindful of the time, make sure we can get to some questions. But let me just ask, what advice do you have to our students and grads, many of which are relatively new entrants, some are more experienced? What skills should they have? What advice would you give?
It's a big topic, right? So what should I do? How should I handle my future? So a lot of things I would say. I do a lot of counseling of people changing careers, new in their career, problems with their careers, all of that stuff. I enjoy that. So a couple of things I would say. I say that, and I've managed big teams, I've reorganized big teams, all that. I could, and I've hired a lot of people. So what I can say is that attitude is so important. Of course, you need to have the baseline skills, but attitude. So you have to have a good attitude. You have to be a team player. You have to be curious and interested and engaged in what you're doing, and that has to be obvious. I also think that when say you're in a job, it's always good to give your boss a little more than they ask for, because the boss is running around with her head cut off, this boss over here. And sometimes you just don't take the time to form the right question. So can you go find this for me? Can you do a paper on that? Can you give me a spreadsheet on blah, blah, blah? Like, you may not have thought it through all the way, but once you go in and do the work, you understand what the person's asking for. So you can always ask a little bit, or you can always go back and ask. No one minds you going back and asking, this is what I found, do you want me to do X, Y, Z? So that's another thing. And another huge thing is, I always say goals are important and they're great, but don't let your goals stand in the way of opportunity. So sometimes, you're like, okay, this is my 5-year track, my 3-year track, my 10-year track, and you're heading there and you're doing great and you're on track. And then something slams you, and there's another opportunity that's completely different than what you thought about. Just be careful, because that might be a great opportunity, and don't just keep going forward. I mean, maybe go forward. I'm not saying don't go forward, but just take a step back and think it through, and maybe ask some friends or something, because you don't know. You just don't know. And I could say that early in my career, there are a couple of things like that I'm now thinking, like, what was I thinking? Why didn't I stop and at least consider it?
I hope everybody was listening to that piece of advice, because I don't know if you ever heard of the book series Chicken Soup for the Soul.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it, but
I haven't read it either, but it's very famous. The guy who wrote that, I'm bad with names. I think his name is Jack Canfield. He wrote a book called The Success Principles. Lots of little interesting pieces of advice. One of them is exactly what you said. People have a certain plan for how they're going to make success in a business, and you're talking about a career, same thing. But if an opportunity comes up that may be more successful and may have more fun and rewarding for you, don't just stick to the plan, because you may have happy accidents, and just opportunistically, you got to move where the opportunities are, and just keep your eyes open. Don't just get stuck in thinking you have to achieve this specific thing, because you might run into something else. That's really great advice.
And actually for managers too, you have to force your people. So I have those situations where I'll say, I think you should move over to this sideways opportunity, and they'll say no. And you have to decide how hard you want to push them, because sometimes you do know better, or sometimes they know better, but you really need to work on those opportunities for your people as well.
There's something that came up just the other day. I was advising one of our grads, and there are different opportunities open to him, and so I was just telling him one of my stories, and I thought one particular thing I think applied is that, on paper, this particular offer I had was really nice. It looked like it really fit. It would get me something that I hadn't had experience in. It was a large increase in staff promotion, and it required to move to another city, whatever. And in my gut, it didn't sit right.
Mhm.
And I was having everything on paper that you think you'd want with it. And I just, and I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to sleep on this. And in the morning, I just passed on it. And it turned out to be a very good move that I passed on it. And the grad said, thanks. That was the piece of advice I needed. You really, and I think you'll agree with me probably, right? That when you look back, we look back, experienced folks look back. The regrets that we have are when we didn't trust an instinct. When our instinct said we should do this or shouldn't do that, or this person, they asked to know. And your gut knows much more than you can ever put down on paper or explain to anybody. And you don't have to. If you trust your instincts know a lot more. I don't know, Holly, do you agree with that?
Completely, but and frankly, it applies in our work, right? So if someone in a risk area, if someone can't articulate something, you need to push, right? You need to say, that doesn't sound right to me. That feels wrong. Like let's spend some more time on that. So yeah, I think your gut in all aspects of your career is as important as it is in your personal life.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. Let's go to Q&A. Okay, here's one. How is S&P thinking about ESG-related risk, especially on the environment side? And how is that thinking evolving your rating products, if at all?
So I think those go actually pretty well together. So remember, I'm on the risk side. I'm not necessarily on the business side, but I certainly am involved in all of how we're doing this. It's really interesting. So ESG type things have always been part of credit risk analysis, right? Especially G, but the other ones, the E and S, have also been part of the analysis. But as a result of the environment we're in and regulatory interest, there's a lot going on the product side where they're exposing more and more of that, being more specific, maybe even updating some of our IP to make it more explicit. So there's a lot going on the credit rating, just the core product that you've seen for how many years and you'll continue to see. In addition, there are some collateral, we call them ancillary products, that are specific to ESG, which may not be explicitly a credit product, but do other type of evaluations. And in our portfolio, there's all different types of products like that are emerging in this very, very large market, where no one knows exactly what's going to be landed as the gold standard, or how we're going to evaluate E versus S versus G. Are we going to put them together? There are a lot of open questions. We are in that area trying to help define it, but I don't think there's nobody who knows the future of that, except that I can tell you that ESG in credit rating products is evolving also very quickly and is relatively mature compared to these standalone products, because it's always been part of the underlying topic. And you'll see that now if you look as a result of coronavirus, some of the weather events, that's very explicit in our products.
Let's go to another question. Do you use a software platform to curate, aggregate, and normalize your KRAs to make sure everyone in the enterprise is measuring on the same scale? Yeah,
that is a good question. So we use a software platform, but it's not an ERM platform. There's some movement to put some in. We use just something called Radar, with a very massive database product that's incredibly flexible. And what I can tell you there is that's great, especially when you're a company that's not a typical company. Like, we're not a broker dealer. It's not hundreds or thousands of us. So there's a software that works for broker dealers or insurance companies. There's just 3 big ones and 8 little ones. So there's no off-the-shelf products. And some of the big ERM packages don't necessarily work for us. So we're working on those as well. But and we have them as well. But the thing that we do day to day, that we live, is this massive database program. And the key there, and what I came in and I learned, we've had this program for a while. It's very flexible. It's a great product, but you can't be too flexible. That is the key. If you just have every user, modifying it, you can't collate. So we have become quite rigorous over the years in kind of organizing that, so that when we do sweep data, looks similar. So we have basically a big database. You could probably use any big database, but you need to be rigorous in how you administer that database in order to do exactly what the questioner asked about, making sure you keep track of this stuff across. And I have to say, that's a problem, right? When you're global, if you have a problem that shows up in Europe and you look at it as a local problem, that could be an issue because it quite possibly is the same problem around the world, and you want to fix it once, not many, many times.
Thank you. Another question. Can you discuss the role risk plays in S&P strategic acquisitions, such as the recently acquired market from pre-acquisition to post-merger?
We are in a quiet period, so I can't really talk about the merger.
Okay, can you talk a bit more about KRIs and the importance you give to them?
So I love that question. Thank you. I could have planted that question and I didn't. So I'm a bit of I have a love-hate relationship with KRIs, right? I think that I don't like safe harbors. I think safe harbors make people lazy. And I think safe harbors just mask a lot of information. So I come to KRIs not happily, but that said, you still need something to hold yourself accountable against. So we have KRI. So what is a KRI? It's pretty much, if you're not in a business where there's, we're not doing balance sheet risk. That's not our business. So maybe other business is different. But if for other areas besides that, it's a number that you think will keep you up at night if you breach, right? That's the only way. So it's a qualitative. So KRA is a quantitative number that you're using qualitatively. And so you need to just make sure that you're using them in the right way, that you're not over or underusing them, right? If you're overusing them, if you don't have a breach, you're like, I'm fine. That's not true. It's not necessarily true. If you breach it, I'm in trouble. It's not necessarily true. So you just need, I look at it as a seat of the pants thing. And the problem there is that they're so exposed to boards and regulators that you can spend a lot of time explaining to them why you are or not concerned about a KRI because it was breached or not breached, but so be it. But I think they're just a tool, one of many tools. You can't over rely on them and you have to adjust them. I think that's another problem. If people just say, okay, I picked the KRI in this climate, well, it's not the same climate. So maybe our risks don't change, but maybe our KRIs do change a fair amount.
What common mistakes do you see some chief risk officers make with their ERM program?
Well, look, it's everything. It's easy to criticize when you haven't lived in their shoes, but it's hard, right? It's not because it is somewhat qualitative. It's hard. So some of the problems that chief risk officers have are communication, right? How do you communicate in a friendly way that your product is used? That's how I tell everybody, look, we want the business to ask for more of what we do. That is success. So how do we get to a point where we are credible, where we're a value add, where they appreciate that? So I think for CROs, I think it'd be hard if your communication tools aren't up to snuff, right? Where you're too harsh, you don't explain, you don't try to align as much as possible to the business. That doesn't mean giving the business what they want. That means making it make sense to them, right? And navigating the different stakeholders, which are the boards, the regulators, the executives, et cetera. So I think that's a mistake. I think being overly tied to metrics is a mistake on either direction. I think also making people do a lot of work for little value add, whether that's actually monitoring or the gathering information to get to a point of monitoring. Like, for example, if you spend a huge amount of time gathering information to come up with a heat map or something related to your top risks, and that information, and you could have gotten 95% there doing 25% of the work, you should not do that extra work. There is no point because you're wasting senior executive times or other people's times to get to the same outcome. So if you know something's a top risk and you're not going to be able to quantify it, don't waste everybody's time is really part of the comment.
I'm glad you mentioned that because practicality is a big part of the value-based enterprise risk management approach, which we teach, which is the foundational part of the master's degree and my work. And there's a key point when I talk about, a lot of ERM programs do gather too much information, and because it's easy, because they're paper survey, they're electronic surveys, so they're paper surveys, so they're not one-on-one. They don't require more time from the ERM team. So they're like, well, let's add this question. Let's get this. Let's get that. And it becomes a SOX plus exercise. expanded into hundreds and thousands of rows where you have to buy a huge system just to aggregate it. And I often say that, a lot of people treat enterprise risk management, because I usually write out on the whiteboard, enterprise risk management, enterprise risk management. Most people think about it this way. They think about risk in parentheses around risk management. Oh, we've done that. Let's just enterprise it. Let's just aggregate everything else, and that's good. But really, it should be about enterprise risk management, finding the big volatility items, so they're managing that. But it comes from a SOX plus compliance, so a lot of people don't think that way. And it's just easier so they gather it, and they don't realize till later that, well, 90% of what they asked for wasn't necessary. Maybe the other 10%, half of that was asked too early, so they have to ask for it again. And what do people love? When you go back and say, oh, all the stuff I gathered for you, well, I didn't really need most of it. And the stuff that I did, well, it's out of date. I got to come back and refresh it. Like, they're not going to want to talk to you. You burn that relationship. They're not coming back. And I think a lot of people don't know how to get to a point where they can practically quantify information to make better risk reward decisions. So they make too much out of the qualitative stuff. And a lot of vendors in the market don't help that, because they're looking to sort of make hay out of that. And that's been an issue. And I'm glad you raised that point. That's a pretty important one. So thank you.
Yeah, I think empathy is really important. We talked about skills. So you have to understand the other person on the other side of it, right? And they understand the value add, or if it's obvious, it's no value add, right? So
can you talk a little bit more about that, though, because this is a big part of our program too. We have 2 of our 7 core courses on communication, strategic communications for risk professionals, and managing and behavior in the organization. And I talk a lot about how, you got to have the right technical models and all that. You got to have that, but more than 50% of it is the people interaction, because you're getting information, sharing information, trying to influence decision making. And can you talk a little bit more about that? A lot of people focus on the tech and the quant. Can you talk about the importance of focusing on humans and interaction, relationships, communication skills?
Yeah, it's just what I said. I mean, think about, for you as a risk professional, me as a risk professional, this is my day job, right? So if I have to do 20% more, it's, it is what it is. It goes in waves. I can also predict it. Them, it's not their day job, right? So when you're asking things from them, it's extra, right? So it's a lot of work for them. Now, they may or may not understand the value, but you need to be sensitive to that. And that's why you always, like I said before, for junior people, you want to give more. It's also, you want to give more to the business. You want to understand, and you want to say, well, I think another thing that that second line does often is they often hide information, or they firewall information. And there's not that. I mean, certainly there's some HR data. There's maybe some legal data that you have to keep separate, but most of it's their business, it's their company. So what can you give back to them, and not data dumps? So where's the give and take of that relationship, where you can say, well, are you interested in seeing these errors in this format here? We have that. Why don't you have it, right? So it's a combination. It's really understanding, what their pain points are, understanding their cycle. You got to understand the business. You can't be asking for them for something during their height of their business. And there's no reason why risk people have to. We can move our calendars around, right? As long as we do it 4 times a year. If we do it in January versus February, it shouldn't matter that much. So we can work around the business's schedule and let them know that too, right? It's key not to just shift. It's like, say, oh, I understand this is a tough time for you. Let's do this in January. Let's do this in November, whatever your time frame is. So I think it's this EQ and really, in it together. It's also you have to communicate at all levels, right? You want to communicate up, but you want your boss to communicate over for you, right? So you need to figure out how to put them in a position that they can do the right things around the top, right? You got to do it for, at your level with your peers. And you have to do it with your own people, of course, but then you have to do it with their people, right? You want to be helpful to their people. And also you want to, as much as possible, move employees between the groups, right? So everybody has the experience, which is great. I mean, if you can have a rotation program, that's great. It's not that common.
So we're coming close to the end. I think we've exhausted the Q&A. Let me just ask one more question from me. What trends do you see possibly coming down the pike for enterprise risk management?
I think, who knows, right? Because these big events really change things. And from my vantage point, I see how political it can become if there's a big event. Then you have, your Congress on top of the regulators, and the regulators can't necessarily do what they had wanted to do because they got to shift to what the political guys are saying. So who knows, especially in this environment. But I see a change in what I was talking about safe harbors. That, historically, a lot of programs, the regulators got comfortable with a certain process, a certain, noise, a certain KRIs. And that was kind of a safe harbor, right? That if you did that, yeah, if something went wrong, you might get in trouble, but you don't get in big trouble. I think that there's a change to more dynamic programs, and that there is no such thing as a safe harbor, and you have to always look and say, why am I doing this? Does this make sense? Does this make sense? And I think the regulators are getting more comfortable with you saying, look, we've done it like this for 10 years, but it doesn't make sense anymore, right? It's very expensive. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of focus on areas that aren't getting us where we need to get. We would like to change, or we are going to change and do X, Y, and Z with the same resources. And I think there's going to be a little more appetite. Now, of course, that's more risky because whatever the new process is, it's going to take a while to figure out, what are the good KRIs? What are good outcomes? Are you looking in the right place? How do you change? But I do think there's going to be more requirements around flexibility in risk programs.
Okay. Well, thank you, Holly, for taking time out of your busy day. We appreciate it to share your thoughts and sit and talk with us. And I want to thank all the attendees for joining. So have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure being here.